So the third person I want to deal with is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, notice that I've said that Hobbes was extremely individualistic. Locke was slightly less individualistic, although still an individualist. Rousseau, in his theory of the social contract and in his philosophy generally, Rousseau is very, very, very individualistic. In fact, he's an extreme individualist, especially early on in his account of the state of nature and the original state of humans. So, what is human nature according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau? We haven't talked about Rousseau very much in this class, and so we need to think about him a little bit. There are two works that I think are really important for him. One is called the Discours sur les origines de l'inégalité, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, and the other one is called Du contrat social, on the social contract. There are many others, including, very importantly, his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. Now, we're going to just talk about Rousseau very, very, very briefly here, and perhaps we'll get a chance to come back to him as well. But he's a very important thinker in the history of philosophy, and he's not somebody to simply put to one side. So it's a kind of a shame that we haven't dealt with him yet. Rousseau is very, very concerned with human freedom. And what happens is he sees that as society develops, and as we leave our basic nature behind and join other people in a community, for him we become more and more unfree. He thinks that with society, with culture, comes a sort of bondage that we could have avoided had we stayed in a natural state, but unfortunately it was not possible for us to remain in that natural state. The view of his social contract is one that he presents as sort of a conjecture about history. Something that I haven't said, that I should have mentioned, is that Hobbes tends to present his social contract and his state of nature as being a hypothetical contract. It's one that he doesn't really present as being a historical thing, although some people have tried to take it that way. He doesn't treat it as an historical fact. Hobbes treats the state of nature as a sort of a what-if story. On the contrary, Locke treats the state of nature as an historical, real fact, and in fact he believes that certain people in the world, in his day, live in the state of nature. This includes, very importantly, the indigenous peoples of North America. Now, Rousseau is a little bit in between. He treats the state of nature as though it were a real thing in his books, and yet you get a feeling that he's kind of imagining how it would have been. And so you can be forgiven for thinking that he doesn't really believe that the state of nature is a genuine historical state in which people lived. Rather, it was something that that's being used in order to understand human nature and the nature of politics and how we got to the place we are. He uses the concept of the state of nature to criticize the state of Western civilization, which he thinks has made us very, very unfree, as I said. He also criticizes Hobbes and Locke. He says that Hobbes's state of nature and also Locke's state of nature is essentially taking human beings as they are civilized, so people from civilization, people from society, and then asking what would happen if we took people as they are now and took away the civilized part of them. What would they be like? And he said, well, of course they'd be like the way they are described, especially by Hobbes, because civilization has made them like that. So Hobbes, in fact, hasn't given us a clear statement about what human nature is really like, according to Rousseau. Rousseau thinks that Hobbes has taken human beings as civilization has distorted them, trained them, if you like, and he's put those people in a state of nature instead of putting actual primitive humans in a state of nature as they would have actually been. And he thinks the same is true, to a lesser extent, of Locke. Locke himself doesn't think that, nor does Hobbes, of course. But you'll notice that what this means is that Rousseau is using this idea of a strict distinction between nature and culture, and he's really expanding upon that and making it important. So that's important. When humans, Rousseau says, when humans start to depend upon each other, humans become less free. Human freedom is lost when humans become dependent on each other. What's human nature? Well, human nature, prior to any social or cultural innovations, was essentially a hunter-gatherer sort of situation where individual humans lived alone in nature, in the forest, naked and running around in the forest, basically looking for food, looking for shelter, and looking for sex. And essentially, as long as we had food, shelter, and sex, we were good. We didn't have language. We didn't have social conventions. We didn't have morality. We didn't have institutions. We didn't even have families. We didn't have social groups. We were individual. We were loners. So you can see Rousseau's individualism is very extreme. What else about the state of nature? Well, over time, we were fine for a very long time, perfectly happy. Human beings aren't violent naturally. In fact, Rousseau thinks that far from being willing to harm or kill each other, as Hobbes says, far from needing to control each other's behavior, as Locke says, human beings, according to Rousseau, naturally are sympathetic, compassionate beings who prefer not to cause violence, prefer not to even see violence. They avoid it at all costs. And what they would rather do is just simply live peacefully in the woods, in the fields, in nature, and just live their lives. Now, the problem is, of course, that over time, there were more and more and more of us. And as the human population grew, it became necessary for us to start cooperating with each other. And in cooperation, we developed language, we developed tool use, we developed things like villages. We started building little huts. We would live together in these little huts. We started developing family bonds and that sort of thing. Well, and through the use of language, we started developing ways to describe our accomplishments, our talents, our abilities. We started to become jealous of each other. We started to want to top each other. Competition started. With the development of tools, we started to be able to develop new devices, new forms of wealth. We could chop wood, we could dig mines, we could do various things like that. We could acquire gold and other things, and we started to become more greedy. As we started to develop these small communities, we started then to develop social norms that went along with them. We developed morality. We developed other standards. We started controlling each other's behavior. We started developing laws, and ultimately we came to the development of the state. Was this a good thing? It was a necessary thing. He doesn't think it was a particularly good thing, but it was necessary. It had to happen. So our basic needs, food, sleep, sex, shelter, clothing, not clothing, but clothing came along, food, sleep, sex, shelter. Our basic needs became corrupted because we started wanting more and more. The greed arose. Eventually we came up with this notion of private property. And as soon as we had private property, we started developing wealth. And then we started developing problems like poverty, slavery, indentureship, things like that. We started developing the notion of a salary. We started developing the notions of the distinction between the boss and the worker. We started developing things like the distinction between the aristocracy and the other classes, the peasant classes, and so on. We started being able to claim ownership in land, which was a very poor negative development in Rousseau's view, and so on and so on. So civil society had to arise. The question, of course, is whether it was the solution to anything. And Rousseau thinks that it was a solution, but it wasn't necessarily the most positive thing. He uses his theory in order to criticize the contemporary state of civilization. Now, what we've seen is that unlike the original views of human nature that were being presented by people like Aristotle, The views of human nature that have dominated in the modern world and come to be very influential in the contemporary world tended to be very, very, very individualistic. This is going to be important later as we go on. And it also expresses itself in anarchism, which I haven't talked about yet, and which I'm not going to talk about in this video. It'll come up either in class or in a future video. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.